I'm sure you all remember that great book, 1984, in which Orwell, unfortunately, we're getting all too close both to the date and the reality. In that book, you will remember that one of the chief devices used by the government to keep its citizens in line was Newspeak. The great slogan of that regime was the slogan, "War is peace." Well, that's the kind of talk which always emanates from Washington. Without anybody voting for it, your taxes are going to go up because inflation inevitably drives more and more of your income into the higher brackets. The increase in the taxes that the people of this country will bear as an indirect result of inflation, without anybody voting for it, will be more than the proposed cut that President Carter is talking about. So even if you look at taxes in the narrow and literal sense, taxes are going up, not down. But even that isn't the whole story, because the real tax that the American people bear is not measured by those payments that are called taxes. The real tax on the American people is what government spends. If the government spends $60 billion more than it takes in the form of taxes, which is roughly what President Carter is proposing, who do you suppose pays that extra $60 billion? Do you think Santa Claus is going to pick up the check? Or maybe President Carter is counting on the Arab sheiks to pick it up. Or maybe there's a tooth fairy out there that'll pick it up. Those are fairy tales. You're going to pick it up because that's going to be paid for. But instead of being paid for directly in the form of income taxes or excise taxes or payroll taxes, it will be paid for indirectly in the form of inflation. A hidden tax which nobody has to vote for, but which people have to bear and pay. There is no other source. The proposal to cut explicit taxes is simply a proposal to raise less money in the form of income, excise, and so on taxes, and more money in the form of the hidden tax of inflation. Well, you may say to me, but there's still another alternative. The government can borrow it. But when the government borrows, that's also only another form of hidden tax. If the government borrows, there's less available to build houses or machines or factories. That imposes a larger burden in the form of future interest or debt payments. That's really a hidden tax on your wealth and your children's future wealth. It's also an indirect form of taxation. Government spending corresponds to that part of the national income which you and I cannot control as we wish, but which is spent for us on our behalf by our supposed servants in accordance with our supposed instructions through the representative method. So in no way is anybody proposing to cut taxes, because President Carter has proposed an increase in federal government spending, an increase which is larger than the anticipated increase in prices. So it's an increase in real terms. And indeed, a larger increase than that which appears in his official budget because of the continued use and invention of more and more sophisticated methods to conceal actual spending. The latest gimmick being to treat subsidies given by the government as refunds of taxes collected from somebody else. Now that's a nice notion, isn't it? I can understand subtracting a refund to me from the tax I pay. But a refund to you from my taxes, that's government spending. That isn't a reduction in tax receipts. So the first example I would give you of Newspeak is the slogan, "Higher taxes are lower taxes." The second is the notion that somehow there are taxes on business and there are taxes on people. There has been a great deal of talk, and I use only the most recent proposals of President Carter for illustration, because this same kind of talk has emanated from every administration, Republican or Democrat. There is talk about how we're not going to raise taxes on people, we're going to raise it on business, on corporations. The most obvious example is with Social Security tax. Supposedly, that tax is half on employee and half on employer. But that's a fake. It's all paid by the employee. It adds to the wage cost of hiring a person. If an employer has to pay in addition to a wage, what is it currently? Close to 6% of the wage? Well, that's that much less that he has available to pay as wages in trying to hire somebody or bid somebody away from somebody else. But more fundamentally, businesses can't pay taxes. A business isn't a person. Only people can pay taxes. A corporate executive may write the check. He may sign his name to it. But who's paying it? It either comes from the customers, or it comes from the workers, or it comes from the stockholders. Where else can it come from? Again, is there somehow some way in which some people can pay, or some funds can be gathered with nobody paying it? Well, tell me, how does business pay taxes? They don't get the money from the heavens. They don't have printing presses in their basements. The only way a business can pay taxes is by collecting it from customers. And if they pay it over to the government, that's not available to cut the price to their customers. It's not available to pay wages to their employees. It's not available to pay dividends to their stockholders. So, of course, all taxes are borne by people and by nobody else. I may say that this same illusion is fostered by businessmen. The businessmen of this country use exactly the same language. They send their lobbyists down to Washington and say, we want relief from taxes on business. That's nonsense. There are no taxes on business. And by talking that way, they are only fostering the illusion that somehow or other, if I may again word it as Orwell would word it in Newspeak, there's no free lunch, but there are free taxes. A third example of Newspeak is the double standard of fairness, which is always being used, one for tax cuts and the other for tax increases. The proposals that have been made by the White House propose to substitute a tax credit for a personal exemption. You are now permitted in the tax code to deduct a small sum as a personal exemption before you compute the income on which taxes are levied. It is now proposed that instead of your being allowed to deduct that from your income, you have a credit of so many dollars which you can deduct from your taxes. Said Secretary Blumenthal a few weeks ago on a nationwide TV program, this was fair because if you increase the tax credit, you reduce the tax for everyone by the same dollar amount. If you make a tax credit $20 higher, everybody gets a $20 reduction in taxes. Whereas he said, if we make the exemption higher, if we add an extra $100 to a personal exemption, that only saves $14 for somebody in the lowest bracket, but it saves $70 for somebody in the highest bracket. And therefore, he said that's not fair. Well, now suppose you turn that around. If fairness consists in reducing the taxes of everybody by the same number of dollars, when you come to increase taxes, does fairness consist of increasing the tax on everybody by the same number of dollars? I don't think even Mr. Blumenthal would have the effrontery to say to a nationwide audience that fair tax increases consist of $20 increase in taxes on the man with a $1,000 annual income and the man with a $100,000 annual income. So he is essentially employing a double standard in discussing tax reductions and tax increases. Or to give another example of the newspeak that unfortunately Mr. Blumenthal has been engaging in. In discussing the proposed tax change, he used the following language, which is very, very common among governmental officials discussing taxes. He said, in our proposals, we are giving so many billions of dollars to business. Now, what do you think of that? Anything he doesn't take from you, he's giving to you. That's exactly the same philosophy that's behind another beautiful semantic invention. Have you ever heard of the semantic invention of tax expenditures? That was invented in order to refer to taxes that were not collected because of so-called loopholes. A simple example is that you are allowed and permitted to deduct interest that you pay in computing your taxes. Well, the Treasury has figured out that because of that deduction, taxes are lower by so many billion of dollars than they otherwise would be. And that lower amount of taxes is described as a tax expenditure. Namely, the government is spending that money. It's spending it by letting you keep it. All of these double newspeak items, or at least the last few I've referred to, are all part of the same approach. The fundamental philosophy that underlies this approach is that you belong to the government. Your income is a government's income. But of course, like any slave owner, the government wants to maintain your productivity. You have to keep you working. And for that purpose, we'll let you keep a little bit of your income so that you can pay for your food and your minimum amount, only the minimum amount, not for those 3 martinis. You may keep a minimum amount so that you can pay for your enough food and clothing and housing to keep you working, and we're going to have to let you keep a little bit of the extra that you earn so that you have an incentive to work. And on these grounds, that's the only justification for having a personal exemption. It's the only justification for having a tax of less than 100%. I suggest to you that if you look carefully at the language that emanates from tax collectors all over the world, fundamentally the underlying theme, and the reason why this whole problem is so important, the underlying theme is that the government is the master, the citizen the slave, his income belongs to government, and he is allowed to keep some of it by the generosity and majesty of Big Brother.